You know, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it feels impossibly complex, right? Like it's rooted in some ancient biblical history. But what if I told you the real story is much, much more recent? In this explainer, we're going to use key historical turning points to build a clearer picture of how this modern conflict actually began and why it's still going on.
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to debunk a huge myth about where this all started. Then we'll walk through the key moments, the promises, the partitions, the wars, and we'll wrap up by looking at the two powerful stories that are really at the heart of the situation today.
Okay, first things first, and this is absolutely crucial. So many of us think of this as some ancient religious war that's been going on forever, but the history, it tells a completely different story, a much more modern one.
And this quote just nails it. It's not about religion in the way you might think. I mean, of course, religion is a huge part of identity for both Israelis and Palestinians. But the conflict itself, it's a modern fight over land, over resources, and over the right to have a country of your own.
So the big takeaway here is that we have to kind of reframe how we think about this. This isn't some timeless religious feud. It's a conflict that's really only about a century old, born from two different groups, two national movements, wanting to build their home on the very same piece of land.
So to really get this shift, let's rewind. Let's look at what the region was like before this all kicked off. This snapshot from 1878 is fascinating. Under the Ottoman Empire, this was a really diverse place. You had a huge Arab majority, both Muslim and Christian, living alongside a small but very long-established Jewish community.
And you hear these stories, right, from historical accounts. They paint this picture of a society where different faiths actually coexisted, for the most part, pretty peacefully. This wasn't a place defined by constant religious fighting. It was a place with a shared culture, all under this big, multi-ethnic empire.
So, the big question is, how did that all fall apart? Well, as the Ottoman Empire started to weaken around the late 1800s, early 1900s, these two new, really powerful nationalist movements started to rise up. And guess what? They both had their eyes on the exact same piece of land.
Over in Europe, anti-Semitism was on the rise, and it was brutal. It convinced people like the journalist Theodor Herzl that trying to just assimilate, it wasn't working. He and others argued that for Jewish people to ever be truly safe, they needed their own country. And this movement, which became known as Zionism, looked to their ancestral homeland as the one place to build it.
Okay, so then World War I happens, and Britain really wanted to beat the Ottomans, so they started making promises, a lot of promises, and they were completely contradictory. They told the Arabs they could have an independent state there, then they secretly told the French they'd split it up, and then they told the Zionists they supported a national home for the Jewish people there. I mean, it was just a complete recipe for disaster.
So the war ends, the Ottoman Empire is gone, and Britain takes over control of the area. They call it the British Mandate for Palestine. But you've got those conflicting promises hanging in the air, and at the same time, a huge surge in Jewish immigration. The whole situation on the ground became incredibly tense, just volatile.
And under British rule, you see this massive acceleration in Jewish immigration, especially with people desperately fleeing persecution in Europe. I mean, look at these numbers. The Jewish population went from being a pretty small minority to almost a third of the entire population in just a couple of decades. That kind of rapid change, it's going to create huge competition with the local Arab population over everything. Land, water, political power, you name it. Things got so bad, with violence escalating, that Britain basically just washed its hands of the whole mess. They gave up. They handed the problem over to the brand new United Nations. So in 1947, the UN comes up with this plan. Let's partition it. Let's split the land into two states, one for the Jews, one for the Arabs. Seemed like a way to try and give both sides what they wanted. So the Jewish leadership says, yes, we accept the plan, and they declare the independence of the State of Israel. But the Arab leaders in all the neighboring Arab countries, they rejected it completely. To them, it looked like a classic European colonial move to just give away their land. And boom, war broke out immediately. A war that would come to be known by two very, very different names, with two completely different meanings. In the end, Israel won the war. But the human cost, it was just immense. More than 700,000 Palestinians either fled or were forced from their homes. They became refugees. And this created a crisis that honestly is still unresolved today. For Palestinians, this moment is known as the Nakba. It means the catastrophe. And when the dust settled, the map looked totally different. Israel now controlled way more territory than the UN had even proposed, including a lot of the land that was supposed to be for that Arab state. And that proposed Palestinian state, it just never happened. All right, so those 1949 armistice lines, people call it the Green Line, that new map pretty much held steady for almost 20 years. But then comes 1967, and another huge war is about to completely reshape the conflict all over again.
This was the 1967 Six-Day War, and Israel won a victory that was just stunning. It was so decisive. In less than a week, they captured the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, the Gaza Strip from Egypt, and the Golan Heights from Syria. And this is the moment that marks the beginning of the Israeli military occupation of Palestinian territories, a situation that, as we know, defines the conflict to this very day.
Right after the war, the UN steps in again. They pass Resolution 242, and this resolution basically creates the famous Land for Peace formula. The idea was simple. Israel withdraws from the territories it just captured, and in return it gets peace and security with its neighbors. It's been the foundation for pretty much every peace talk since, but it's never actually been fully implemented.
So now you have millions of Palestinians living under military occupation, and this kicks off a whole new phase of the conflict. Palestinian resistance starts to grow, but at the same time, so does the Israeli settlement movement, building new Jewish communities right inside those newly occupied territories.
And what you start to see is this really tragic, recurring cycle. You can see it on this timeline. First, frustration boils over into a popular uprising, an intifada. That pressure leads to peace talks, like the Oslo Accords in the 90s, which gave people a lot of hope. But then, the talks fail, and that failure just leads to even more violence.
That word, intifada, it's Arabic for shaking off, and it's used to describe these huge popular uprisings. The first one, back in the late 80s, it started with things like boycotts and protests, widespread civil disobedience, but it escalated. The second one, though, which kicked off after peace talks fell apart in 2000, that one was way more violent, right from the very beginning. It was a really dark turn for everyone involved.
Okay, so after all that history, the wars, the uprisings, the failed peace talks, if we really want to understand why this is so hard to solve, we have to take a step back. We have to look at the two powerful, competing stories at the center of it all. And this, right here, is the absolute core of the stalemate. Each side has a powerful, deeply personal story that is completely rooted in their own history. The Palestinian narrative is one of being driven from their homes, living under decades of military occupation, and being denied a country of their own. The Israeli narrative is one of a people returning to their ancient homeland after centuries of persecution, finally having a safe place and needing to defend it to survive. And here's the hardest part. Both of these stories are true.
Look, just understanding these two truths doesn't magically solve anything. Of course not. But it does clarify the real question we should be asking. The challenge isn't about picking a side or deciding which history is more right. The real challenge is this. How can two peoples, with two completely valid and incredibly painful histories, how can they ever build one shared future?